In August 1943, as summer heat shimmered over the bomb-scarred rail platforms of southern Germany, General Adolf Galland stood waiting for a train that would carry him to a confrontation destined to echo through military history. The war in the air was shifting, but few within the Nazi high command seemed willing to admit it. Galland, the charismatic and sharp-eyed general of fighters, had received disturbing intelligence reports that challenged the very foundation of the Luftwaffe's defensive doctrine. American P-38 Lightning fighters, once thought too limited in range to penetrate deep into the Reich, were now appearing over central Germany. They had been fitted with new external fuel drop tanks, extending their reach far beyond what Göring's intelligence officers believed possible. For Galland, this was not rumor, it was reality. He had eyewitness accounts from his pilots, radar traces from Luftwaffe control centers, and wreckage confirming that these new American escort fighters were engaging German interceptors hundreds of kilometers from the front lines. It was the kind of data that demanded immediate response, rethinking tactics, redeploying resources, and acknowledging a turning point in the air war. But as Galland traveled to meet Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring at Karen Hall, the ornate estate that had become the symbolic heart of Luftwaffe command, he carried more than just papers. He carried a warning about the survival of Germany's air defense itself. When Galland entered Göring's private office, the contrast between soldier and statesman was striking. Galland spoke bluntly. The Americans had achieved long-range escort capability. The bombers that once could be intercepted freely would now come protected all the way to their targets. He urged Göring to act before it was too late, to accelerate development of improved interceptors, to conserve veteran pilots, to adapt. Göring, however, refused to believe it. He dismissed the intelligence with a wave of his gloved hand, insisting that the Americans did not possess the technology or courage to escort bombers deep into the Reich. To him, such claims were defeatist talk, unworthy of the Luftwaffe's proud spirit. His denial was total and his pride impermeable. Galland left the meeting frustrated, sensing that something had broken within the chain of command, not the machinery of war, but the will to see truth. In that moment, the Luftwaffe's fate began to seal itself, not in the skies, but in the corridors of arrogance and denial. The seeds of collapse had been planted, and history would soon show how costly Göring's blindness would become. In the early morning of August 17, 1943, the hum of engines rose over the English countryside as hundreds of American bombers lifted into formation. Operation Double Strike was underway, a daring twin assault onto critical industrial targets deep inside Germany, the Messerschmitt Aircraft Works in Regensburg and the ball-bearing factories of Schweinfurt. The mission was designed to cripple the Luftwaffe's ability to produce fighters and to disrupt its logistical backbone. As the massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses crossed the North Sea, German radar stations began tracking them, and sirens wailed across the Reich for the Luftwaffe's fighter command. This was another opportunity to strike at the enemy's heavy bombers, but they were not prepared for what awaited them. General Adolf Galland's earlier warnings now took on grim clarity. Luftwaffe units scrambled according to outdated interception plans, expecting to meet unescorted bombers whose defensive formations could be broken apart through coordinated head-on attacks. Instead, as German fighters climbed into the morning sky, they found themselves facing not only bombers but fast-moving American escort fighters, the feared P-38 Lightnings, already engaging over German territory. Reports flooded in from squadron leaders. The bombers were protected far beyond previous limits, the American fighters showing up where they had never been seen before. Confusion spread through the command network as veteran German pilots, many flying Bf-109s and FW-190s, suddenly found themselves outmaneuvered. The precision of the Luftwaffe's interception system, once unmatched in Europe, was unraveling before their eyes. Over Regensburg, the fighting was fierce. Dozens of B-17s went down, but so did many of Germany's finest interceptors. As the bombers turned south toward their recovery bases in North Africa, the second wave pressed on toward Schweinfurt. There, amid heavy anti-aircraft fire, the Luftwaffe attempted to regroup. But the psychological damage had been done. Pilots who once saw themselves as masters of the air now questioned the reliability of their command. If the Americans could strike Regensburg and Schweinfurt in a single day with fighter escort, what would come next? By nightfall, smoke rose from factory districts and airfields alike. The Luftwaffe had inflicted losses on the enemy, but its own suffered even greater blows: fuel expended, aircraft destroyed, irreplaceable veterans lost. Yet at Karen Hall, Hermann Göring congratulated his staff, boasting of a great defensive victory. He refused to acknowledge that the American bombers had reached their targets and returned with fighter protection. The generals beneath him, fearful of his wrath, echoed his delusion. Galland watched in silence, realizing that his warning at the station had already become prophecy. The Luftwaffe's denial had taken flight, and it would soon crash into reality. As September 1943 dawned, the air over Germany no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The twin strikes on Regensburg and Schweinfurt had exposed a hard truth. The Americans had solved the puzzle of long-range escort, and their bombers could now reach targets once thought invulnerable. Yet within the upper echelons of command, denial had hardened into doctrine. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring issued glowing communiques about the Luftwaffe's resilience, claiming that Germany's skies were secure. His words, printed in newspapers and broadcast across the Reich, painted a vision of invincible air defense. But among the pilots who faced the reality of combat, the mood was grim. General Adolf Galland, still commanding the fighter arm, continued to send urgent memoranda warning that the situation was unsustainable. His reports detailed the growing losses of experienced airmen, the exhaustion of replacement reserves, and the technological superiority of the American escort fighters. Each time a raid was intercepted, Luftwaffe squadrons suffered crippling attrition. In 1 week alone, entire Gruppen were reduced to half strength. Aircraft production, already strained by Allied bombing, could not keep pace with demand. Yet Göring, cocooned within his ornate headquarters, refused to accept the data. When Galland presented a report on the effectiveness of American drop tanks and their influence on fighter range, Göring accused him of spreading defeatist propaganda. He preferred to believe that his men lacked courage, not aircraft capability. Through September and October, the pattern repeated itself. Allied bombers struck Stuttgart, Bremen, and Munster. In every raid, the same story unfolded. The bombers came with escorts, P-38s, and the emerging P-47 Thunderbolts, pushing deeper into Germany, engaging the Luftwaffe in relentless battles of attrition. The German pilots, many of them teenagers fresh from training, faced veteran American crews with superior equipment and numbers. On October 14, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt, later known as Black Thursday, shattered what remained of German confidence. While the Americans suffered heavy bomber losses, they demonstrated an ability to strike at will, forcing Germany to disperse its industry and spread its defenses then. After the raid, Galland once again stood before Göring, urging immediate tactical reform. He proposed new aircraft allocation strategies, pilot preservation policies, and an honest appraisal of the situation. Göring, furious, accused Galland of cowardice and defeatism, telling him that the American bomber force will collapse before the Reich does. Those words, meant to inspire, instead revealed the depth of delusion consuming the Luftwaffe's leadership. The gulf between truth and belief had become fatal. By refusing to acknowledge reality, Göring ensured that every new battle would cost Germany not just aircraft and pilots, but the very chance of recovery. By November 1943, the Luftwaffe that once ruled the skies of Europe was unraveling from within. General Adolf Galland's reports had grown more urgent and more despairing. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In just 3 months, fighter losses had doubled. Veteran aces, the men who once defined German air superiority, were vanishing, replaced by inexperienced recruits who had barely learned to fly combat missions. The Luftwaffe's once meticulous training programs were being shortened drastically to meet the desperate demand for replacement pilots. Fuel shortages, industrial sabotage, and relentless Allied bombing raids compounded the crisis. Every attempt to sustain the illusion of control only deepened the disaster. In his December 1943 summary to the Air Ministry, Galland wrote that the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee the protection of the Reich's industrial heartland. The data showed that Allied bombers now reached target as far as Leipzig and Bremen almost unopposed. Their long-range escorts, the formidable P-47 Thunderbolts, and the newly arriving P-51 Mustangs, cutting through the thinning ranks of German interceptors. These developments confirmed everything Galland had warned of since that August meeting at Karen Hall. Göring, however, continued to reject such assessments, insisting that the enemy's strength was exaggerated and that victory was merely a matter of morale and willpower. He preferred public spectacle to military realism, focusing on parades and press statements that celebrated phantom successes. As 1943 came to a close, Luftwaffe field commanders reported chaotic conditions. Aircraft were grounded for lack of spare parts, squadrons were reassigned overnight, and inexperienced cadets were being rushed into combat with barely 20 flight hours. Allied air superiority now dominated both day and night, with bombing raids targeting not only factories but also transportation networks and airfields. The Luftwaffe had ceased to function as a coordinated defense system. Instead, it fought fragmented battles of survival, losing ground with every engagement. Galland's warnings, long ignored, became hauntingly prophetic. He saw that the war in the air had been lost not simply through enemy innovation, but through internal blindness. The refusal to adapt, to acknowledge changing technology and tactics, had doomed the Luftwaffe more effectively than any Allied weapon. By denying reality, Göring had led his Air Force into strategic self-destruction. The collapse of the Luftwaffe by the end of 1943 marked a decisive turning point in World War II. From that moment onward, the skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. Galland's unheeded intelligence reports and his struggle against bureaucratic denial stand as enduring lessons in leadership failure and the high cost of arrogance in warfare. History would record that the Luftwaffe's defeat began not with enemy fire, but with the silence of those who refused to listen.